do differentiable HPC simulation-based discussing cosmological?
Should I use the mic or is it okay with that? Mic? Okay.
Please.
Good. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to tell you about this work that I've been doing for a few years now in the context of cosmological inference with large-scale surveys and trying to analyze these surveys. Is this good? Yes. Okay, good. And trying to analyze the surveys using simulations. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of how we've been analyzing this survey so far and what is the change of approach that we're trying to do here. So traditionally, when I analyze a survey like a cosmic shear survey, the thing that I do is that I go on the sky, I make some measurement. So here, for instance, I can measure the shear on galaxies and try to make map of that cosmological signal. But the way that I analyze this cosmological signal is not at the level of these maps, is by condensing it first into some sort of simple summary statistics. So traditionally, the way we do this is by computing a power spectrum from these maps. And so those are the data points that you see here on the left. And we have theoretical models that we can use to predict what should be the cosmology that matches those data points. Okay. So at that point, when I have an analytic model that I can use to model the likelihood of my summary statistics given cosmology, I can feed that into an MCMC and I can obtain my cosmological parameters or posteriors on my cosmological parameters and constrain cosmology. So that has been the traditional way to do this, and it's still the correct or the way that people do it, but it has a few limitations. And intrinsically, essentially, we cannot analyze the data itself. We have to summarize it with some simple summary statistics first. And when you do this, you lose a lot of information that was there in the data itself. And the second limit is that even in this case, our models for modeling the likelihood of the data are limited to only the large scales, and they start to fail in the small scales of the signal. Okay. So in this process, it works, but to make it robust, we actually lose a lot of information that was there to begin with. So how could we go at this problem from a different perspective? And so another approach that you could take to analyze your data is instead of trying to condense it into some summary statistics, you can try to write down a full simulation model for the data that you would observe. And so in this particular case, it would mean writing an n-body simulation code, ray tracing through that n-body the Weak gravitational lensing signal that I would observe then on the sky. And if I wanted to push it to its limit, I could also imagine having a simulation that goes all the way to simulating the pixel level data that I have on my survey. So in this way of thinking of the problem, the simulator itself becomes my physical model that I use to analyze the data. Okay? The problem is that writing down a simulation model this way, I have to introduce a lot of new variables that describe everything that can happen in the signal, in the data. And at the end of the day, essentially it means that my simulation, I can think of it as a very complex probabilistic model that I can sample from to generate examples of the data. But it has a lot of what I call latent variables. So random variables that are necessary to produce all of the complexity of the signal, but are not the cosmological parameters that I'm interested in. But one of the advantages of using this approach is that now I have a model that can model the signal in all of its complexity. I can very easily add systematic effects because it's just a simulation. And I can very easily combine data that different cosmological probes because all of these probes can be modeled jointly in one simulation model. So that is the idea here. But then the question becomes, how do I perform inference? How do I estimate parameters over such simulation models? There are two strategies that exist currently. There is one that is called implicit inference. And here, the idea is giving up on trying to keep track of all the statistics of all of these latent variables and just use my simulation as a thing that can generate pairs of data points and cosmological parameters. So this is a sampler, if you want, of this joint distribution here. And then if I have such a sampler, I can use machine learning methods to learn either a likelihood function from those examples or directly estimate posterior estimates. So just having this black box simulator, I have procedures that exist these days to infer cosmologies from examples. The second way is to try to do this by not getting rid of our understanding of what happens in the simulation and keeping track of all of these latent variables. And so you can think of it as doing Bayesian inference in this case over a very complex, very large hierarchical Bayesian model that can have millions or even hundreds of millions of variables in addition to the cosmological parameters theta that I'm interested in. So that is something that is in principle possible, but has been extremely challenging to do for a long time because you would have to solve a sampling problem, a Bayesian sampling problem, over numbers of dimensions that can be in the billions of dimensions. So far it has been intractable. But the interesting to think about is that these are just two strategies, but they, in principle, should converge to the same answer. So the thing that I want to tell you about today is this idea of trying to do explicit inference, so fitting your entire simulation model to your data and inferring cosmology with that. And this is something that I will call explicit inference because we have an explicit probabilistic model that we try to fit to the observations. And so the thing that we would do here is having something that looks like this. We have cosmological parameters, we have latent variables in our simulator, and we have observations here. And we actually keep track of the entire joint log likelihood of all of this simulation model. And then what we need to do in order to do inference is to sample from the pair of variables, those latent variables, jointly with those parameters theta. And at the end of the day, we can marginalize over those latent variables theta that we don't care about, and we can obtain the posterior on cosmology that we would like to do. So this is an inference problem that involves 10 to the 9 dimensions for an n-body simulation, maybe even more than that. And there is no way that you can solve that inference problem with traditional MCMC techniques. Thankfully, in recent years, we've seen a bunch of new methods that allows you to sample very complex and high-dimensional posteriors in very high dimensions, as long as you have access to the gradients of the likelihood function that you're trying to sample from. And by that, I mean being able to take the derivative of your likelihood with respect to either the cosmological parameters of interest or the variables, the latent variables of interest. And if I have that, I can actually direct my sampling method to navigate this high-dimensional space directly towards the regions of maximum posterior mass. So how do we do this in practice? We need to have access to simulation models that have the property of being differentiable, that allows us to compute those gradients through the likelihood function, through the simulation, and back to the cosmological parameters. And thankfully, with the, let's say, the emergence of deep learning, we now have access to libraries, software libraries, that allow us to compute the derivatives of any functions that you could implement in those frameworks. And I won't go into too much detail here. The whole point is that even if you have never touched machine learning or anything, you can use these libraries very easily nowadays with libraries such as JAX. And so what we've done is that we have implemented full end-to-end simulations in such frameworks that we can then get gradients over and use them for solving these high-dimensional inference problems. So I won't go into all the details of the different steps that are needed in order to make a full end-to-end model, but I'll just say a few words about this first step, being able to run the n-body simulation that gives us a large-scale structure. And for doing this first step, we have implemented a very simple approximate particle mesh algorithm, which is simple and very fast. All it needs to do is taking a bunch of particles, gridding them on a grid, a 3D grid in this case, and that gives us an estimate on a grid of the density of matter. And then from that, we can, with FFTs, compute gravitational forces at the position of each particle and displace them according to those forces. And so you can create an approximate n-body simulation this way at the cost of low resolution on small scales, but it's extremely simple to implement, simple operations, and it goes really fast. So this is something that we've done. We have also implemented lensing with it. But one of the most challenging aspects is that so far it was very difficult to generate those differentiable simulations to the scale that we need for cosmological surveys, so on cosmological volume scales. And so that's the point that I wanted to just conclude on, is that we've done a lot of work to add very efficient operations within those frameworks that allow us to actually use HPC resources to compute simulations that will be differentiable. And I'm just going to show you this slide. This is our implementation of a library called QDecomp. It's a very low-level, highly efficient library for doing distributed FFTs over potentially a very large number of GPUs, and we use that library to implement some of the fundamental components that are necessary to run those n-body simulations. And because it's coupled with this JAX library, we can run end-to-end n-body simulation on large scales and get gradients. And I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to take questions on where this is going. Thank you.
Forgive this from non-cosmologists, but how good does the simulation have to be up front for this to be worth it?
Exactly. So this is one of the challenges here of all of these methods that are based on simulation, whether it's this approach or this implicit inference that I mentioned. Everything relies on having the ability to create realistic enough simulations. So in practice, we cannot push the fidelity of this simulation to high enough resolution such that we could analyze a signal on small scales. And by small scales for lensing, it means below a few arc minutes on the sky. But they start to become, let's say, good enough quality when you smooth out the signal on large enough scales. So this is the limit, but we can always apply a smoothing filter and only look at larger scales. And then as we go toward larger and larger scales, the simulations become good enough. There is still more information than just traditional two-point functions on those larger scales. But this is the limit that remains an open challenge. It's pushing them to enough resolution and enough accuracy.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
So it seems like if you do the thing that we normally do nowadays first, that might significantly reduce the difficulty of doing your process backwards, as it were.
That's right. Yeah. So you could do the traditional analysis that would restrict the parameter space that you think is plausible under a traditional analysis, and then you could work only within that smaller parameter space. And that means that you potentially don't have to run as many simulations because you don't have that much space to explore.
Sure.
Definitely true.
So are you doing that now, or?
Not yet, no. So these methods, the one that I'm presenting here, has never been deployed on real data so far because of these challenges. And the main one has been this technical challenge of being able to run those simulations on large enough volumes that you could analyze actually interesting cosmological surveys. So this is the frontier that we're just right now, being able to cross.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Is there any fundamental limitation of going to more accurate methods?
So the fundamental limitation in the compute speed. You need to be able to run those simulations on the fly. And so you can't run a full hydro simulation on the fly. It would take too long. So you need to cut corners to some extent. And that's part of this modeling challenge. You need to find fast approximation that allows you to still get a good quality. So that's the limit. And you can only do this to some extent so far. But yeah, that's where the limit is.
Any more comments or questions? Let's thank our speaker. So our second speaker is suppression of cooling flows by cosmic rays in jet Cacoon shock.
Yeah, should I use the mic? Where is it? So thanks very much for having me here. I'm Kong Su, currently a postdoc at Blackwood Initiative. So I just learned that I'm giving this talk 2 days ago. I'm filling some other spots. So I'm going to talk about suppression of cooling flow by cosmic ray in the jet Cacoon shock front. So this concludes several of my previous and ongoing work trying to understanding the cosmic ray associated with jet, how they could potentially suppress the cooling flow and quench these massive galaxies. So we know that in massive galaxy, there's cooling flow problems. In a brief few sentences, we observe strong extra luminosity in these massive galaxies, and that should imply strong cooling flow. And given such strong cooling flow, we might expect there's a lot of gas fall into the center of galaxy and form way too many stars. So these galaxies are typically quenched, so there's no significant star formation. So this all tells us there must be some sort of heat source or pressure support that should be able to compensate the cooling flow. And a very promising candidate of doing that is AGN jet. So we do find observational evidence of the presence of AGN jet suppressing the cooling flow. So for example, this X-ray image of Milky Way. You do see this X-ray bubble at above and below the midplane of the galaxy, which is presumably inflated by a previous episode of AGN. And also there's also multi-wavelength observations of outer system of radio bright AGN extended to very large radius. However, in the galaxy scale simulations, to model AGN feedback, we typically require a subgrid model, which means that we have a very effective accretion model, like a Bondi type model or gravitational torque type model. And we just based on that, based on the density, temperature around a black hole, and assign some accretion rate and return some of the accreted mass or energy and arbitrarily form the AGN feedback. So this leaves the huge uncertainties in how we actually implement AGN feedback in the galaxy scale simulation. So there's a huge uncertainty, and more often than not, we're just parameterizing our ignorance. So here we are trying to do to partially address this. We are doing a very broad parameter study extending all the possible physical variations of AGN jet. So instead of varying the injection part and the accretion part together, here we focus on a set of constant energy flux jet. We vary things like the energy form. We have kinetic, thermal, cosmic ray dominant jet, and magnetic energy. For each of them, we change the energy fluxes, opening angle, some level of jet precession, and also manually putting some duty cycles. And these are the extensive set of runs we've checked. So we did most of the study in our early work on 10 to the 14 solar mass halo. So in this halo mass range, the cooling flow problem is already very severe, but we can afford a huge parameter study. For a subset of more successful run, we further test them in our later work from 10 to 12, 10 to 15 solar mass. So we want to make sure we want to cover a broad halo mass range. As you differ the halo mass range, you also change the temperature in the CGM and also the density in CGM. That significantly change the cooling flow properties. So based on the previous work, we found there's three categorical model that kind of works the best for suppressing the cooling flow and quenching this massive galaxy. One is cosmic ray dominant jet. The other is very hot thermal jet with plasma temperature initially higher than a few times 10 to the 9 Kelvin. And also very fast kinetic jet with wide precession or wide open angle. So as you can see, the star formation rate as a function of time for these 10 to 12, 10 to 13, 10 to 14, and 10 to 15 runs, given sufficient high energy flux, all of these models can successfully quench the massive galaxy, as I highlighted in these runs here. The star formation rate fall into this gray region, which we define as quenched. More importantly, I want to highlight a few runs. These are the blue and the cyan lines. These are the run with cosmic ray jet. Given the same energy flux, they all quench more efficiently than any other variations. And the reason we found is that cosmic ray provide extra pressure support. So as you can see, there's a movie, there's entropy profile. This is cosmic ray pressure profile. You do see this cosmic ray pressure build up a pressure gradient extended to a few 10 kiloparsec, and that helps suppressing the cooling flow by a lot. However, there is some potential problems for cosmic ray energy dominant jet, especially in the highest halo mass end. So it could very easily lead to excessive gamma ray flux due to the hydronic process in our 10 to the 15 solar mass sample. And also the traditional way we inject cosmic ray is not necessarily tracking the larger scale shock front in the galaxy scale, which presumably is where the cosmic ray is accelerated. So here then we dive into the question of how and where we should actually inject cosmic ray, and in particular how the different proximity launching method interact with the black hole accretion. So to actually go into a bit detail of this, how we actually model the jet and how we should implement the cosmic ray here, is that we're using particle spawning method to model the propagation of the jet, which means that we're shooting out resolution element or gas particles from the black hole to model the propagation of the jet. There's two places that we can actually inject energy. One is when the jet particle is created from the black hole. We can assign its mass, velocity, temperature, magnetic field, cosmic ray. So this gives you a mass flux, momentum flux, energy flux, magnetic energy flux, and cosmic ray energy flux. And of course, the motivation of inject cosmic ray here is try to capture the sub-resolution physics that's not captured in the galaxy scale simulations. However, taking advantage of particle spawning method, we can also very easily inject cosmic ray at a larger scale jet Cacoon shock front, which we have a toy model just inject cosmic ray when the spawn jet particle is decelerated to 1/4 of its initial velocity. So when this happens, we say that that jet particle is already encountered strong shock, and we can just inject cosmic ray there. And of course, this is trying to capture the cosmic ray accelerated at the larger scale jet Cacoon shock front. And we test these two kind of things on top of the black hole accretion and make it a live accretion and found very interesting things. So left-hand side, these are the run with cosmic ray injected at the black hole vicinity. This is order of unity in cosmic ray, 0.1 energy in cosmic ray. Right-hand side, this is also another runs with 0.1 energy in cosmic ray, but at a larger scale shock front. Upper panel here is density profile. Lower panel here is cosmic ray pressure profile. So if I play the movie, you immediately see a huge difference between the left-hand side category and right-hand side category. So if you inject cosmic ray at a black hole vicinity, you very easily result into a super episodic accretion history, which manifests as a very episodic energy flux from the jet. On the other hand, if you inject cosmic ray at a larger scale shock front, it can sustain a higher energy flux over a much longer period of time. And also, if you see the cosmic ray pressure profile, you also see that if you inject cosmic ray at a black hole vicinity, you get much cuspier distribution of cosmic ray. A lot of them is concentrated at a black hole vicinity. On the other hand, if you inject cosmic ray at a larger scale jet Cacoon shock front, it gets a much more extended cosmic ray distribution. And that can actually help quenching the galaxy. So for example, this is a run that actually quench that has 0.3 of the energy, inject a larger scale shock front. Upper panel here is radial velocity. Red is inflowing gas, black is outflowing gas. And the lower panel is the cosmic ray pressure. So if I play the movies, you do see that the cosmic ray do build up a significant pressure gradient around the black hole vicinity. And that actually quench. So this is a sharp ratio as a function of time. This run is the blue line. It does create a quenching duty cycle of a few hundred to 1 giga-year duty cycle. And it's much more effective in quenching than any other of the runs where you inject cosmic ray at a black hole vicinity. So if you further look at the accretion history and the energy flux of the jet as a function of time, you do see that if you inject cosmic ray at a larger scale shock front, it can sustain a higher energy flux of the AGM feedback over a longer period of time. And the duty cycle is roughly a few hundred to 1 giga-year. On average, it's a higher energy flux. And if on the other hand, if you inject cosmic ray at a black hole vicinity, like what you do in the green and the red line here, you create this very sawtooth-like, very episodic accretion history, which also show in the energy flux of the jet. The reason is that if you further look into density and temperature profile, if you inject cosmic ray at a black hole vicinity, it very easily results into this episodic suppression of density around a black hole. And that actually caused the episodic suppression of the black hole accretion history. And overall, on average, it has a lower energy flux and less effective in quenching. Another very interesting we found is how the precession couple into this picture. So especially when you're launching cosmic ray at a larger scale shock front, you are trying the level of precession actually change the position of the shock. They actually coupled non-linearly to these problems. So here are 3 runs. We all inject cosmic ray at the larger scale Cacoon shock front, but with different level of precession. Left-hand side, no precession. Longer precession period, 100 million year. Shorter precession period, 10 million year. Again, upper panel is cosmic ray pressure profile. Lower panel is radial velocity. Red is inflowing gas. Black is outflowing gas. So it indeed sees that the level of precession indeed changed the position of the shocks. And if you inject cosmic ray there, they actually change the cosmic ray distribution. So for example, if you have a jet that is not precessing, a lot of the shock is pushing further and further, eventually to a few hundred kiloparsec. And you do see the cosmic ray pressure extended to like a super large radius. And that actually have a negligible effect of how and whether it can quench the galaxy. So for example, this is a sharp measurement as a function of time. Right-hand side is a cosmic ray pressure profile. So if you inject cosmic ray at a larger scale shock front, but there's no precession at all, like what you do in the green line here, you very easily result into like excessive cosmic ray, and a lot of cosmic ray is distributed to like a few hundred kiloparsec. On the other hand, if you at least have some level of precession, a lot of cosmic ray can be distributed to a few 10 kiloparsec, which especially for this 10 to the 14 solar mass is measured where the cooling flow is happening. And if you inject cosmic ray there, it has a maximum effect in quenching the massive galaxy, as you see in this red line and the blue line here. There's some level of precession, and the star formation is suppressed by larger amount than the run with no precession. So we found a sweet spot of the precession of like 10 million year-ish of the precession. It's most effective, have most of the shock retaining a few 10 kiloparsec. If you inject cosmic ray there, that has a maximum effect in suppressing the cooling flow and quenching the massive galaxies. So to summarize, we found that cosmic ray actually quench most efficiently compared with any other form of jet. The major reason is cosmic ray pressure support. But how and where the cosmic rays actually launch actually matters. If you inject them at a larger scale shock front instead of around a black hole vicinity, you can result in a more extended cosmic ray distribution, longer duty cycle, overall higher energy flux, and more effective in quenching the massive galaxy. The level of precession also matters, especially when you launch cosmic ray at a larger scale shock front. It changes the location of the shock and then changes the distribution of the cosmic ray. Some sweet spot of a few 10 million year might be the sweet spot of precession that have most of the energy of the cosmic ray retaining a few 10 kiloparsec. And that has a maximum effect in suppressing the cooling flow and quenching this massive galaxy. So I'll stop here and take any questions. Thanks.
You didn't talk a lot about magnetic fields. So what sort of assumptions do you have to make about magnetic fields?
Yeah, so thing is that so initially there's definitely some seed magnetic. So we are using isolated gas simulations. Initially, there is some seed toroidal magnetic field, and for the jet particles when we launch the jet, we also assume some magnetic field strengths for those spawn jet particles. We try to Monte Carlo sample some toroidal distribution of the magnetic field when the jet particle is launched. So for most of the runs that I have with cosmic ray on, the magnetic energy in the jet is subdominant to the cosmic ray energy. Either way, yeah.
Yeah, so just have you gotten a chance to look at at later times after you've injected lots of cosmic rays, what that does to the density of the CGM in lower mass halos?
Yeah, so I think to the zeroth order, if you just look in the bulk part density entropy profile, it still roughly resemble what observed from the X-ray, like the implied density entropy profile. I think it more resemble the non-core core system rather than the core core system, but more or less it's still roughly there. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, go ahead.
As you probably know, there were other data from fire,
Yeah.
and you might be also in this paper, I'm sure, that show that if you have a cosmic ray element halo, it can slow down the cooling flow and let the gas settle on the more thin disk with the more smooth star formation rate. I was wondering if the effects you are seeing are similar, or these cosmic rays injected by black holes are.
Yeah, I think the cosmic ray I'm injecting is so those fire paper. I think those are cosmic ray in the supernova.
Yeah.
So overall, I think the flux is lower.
So it's a question of energetics. So
Yeah, I think the things I'm injecting is much higher energy.
Right, but when you show the star machine histories, it's not like the galaxy is quenched, right? So it's, it's not
Yeah.
zero,
There's
sounds
episodic
much lower.
quenching. Yeah.
Okay.
But compared with the run with other form of jet or no jet at all, it's still much more suppressed the softness. Yeah.
Right, but there's still a disk.
Yeah, there's still some disk still retaining in the CGM. Yes.
We have any more questions?
I was wondering if you could explain more on what you are considering for the injection of cosmic rays and shocks. Is it you are reaccelerating them through ESA, or what is it that you are assuming?
So what I'm trying to do is trying to capture the cosmic ray. It's accelerated in the larger scale shock. So we know that shock can accelerate cosmic ray, but if you are just always launching cosmic ray around a black hole, you are not actually putting cosmic ray in those positions that cosmic ray should be accelerated. So that's the motivations that I'm try to put as much of cosmic ray where that should be accelerated in the larger scale galaxy shock. Yeah.
You mentioned that your condition for tracing the shock is just that it's been decelerated by
Yes.
a factor of a quarter.
Yeah.
Why not just also check that the density has gone up by a factor of a quarter or factor?
Yeah. So that's definitely this super toy model. Just we're trying to inject cosmic ray in the shock without doing a real shock finding, which could be more difficult in the galaxy simulations. But yeah, so I think that's a starting point the most easy prescription that we can think of. Definitely down the line, we're checking. We definitely want to see whether we're indeed injecting at the shock front, how much we're injecting the shock front, and whether those are reasonable numbers. So yeah, that's definitely something we want to check for the long run.
Okay, I think we're okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Is it yours?
Yeah.
You have to plug it in. Or I'll just use it for the laser.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so our next speaker,
Yeah.
Lachlan Lancaster from Columbia. He's going to talk about geometry, dissipation, and the dynamical evolution of Higgs-boson bubbles.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I saw some people finish their lunch, so everyone else, thank you for sticking around. My long talk title maybe scared some people away, but I'll try and go through it quickly. So to get right into it, I'm going to be talking about stellar wind bubbles, sort of mechanical feedback-driven bubbles. These I will be mostly thinking about from stellar winds. These are winds from massive O and B type stars and star-forming regions. But all of the same sort of physics applies to things from AGN-driven wind bubbles or super bubbles in the ISM. And the main problem here that I'm trying to address is that, at least in star-forming regions, we think that these stellar winds should be very good at dominating sort of the early feedback that happens before supernovae in giant molecular clouds. But if you go and look at their effects by observing the X-ray emission from wind-driven bubbles, this is Orion, the blue X-ray here is Messier 82 for sort of a starburst-driven bubble, then the pressures of the hot gas that you infer are much, much lower than you would expect for sort of a classical energy-driven picture. So what is that classical energy-driven picture? Just before I do that, I'm just going to define these sort of basic wind parameters, the wind mass loss rate, the wind velocity. These are sort of the physical things that you think about when you're driving some sort of wind into some medium. And with those, you can define these two things, a mechanical luminosity and a momentum injection rate. Okay. So our two sort of limiting solutions for the evolutions of these sorts of bubbles will be based on sort of considering this as the important parameter or this as the important parameter. So the first one is this sort of classical picture. You have some source, you drive wind into the surroundings, you have some free stellar wind that's basically super or even hypersonic, goes through a strong shock, and that sort of interior wind material is separated from the surroundings by this perfect contact discontinuity, and then you have the surrounding shocked ISM that's usually able to cool pretty quickly, so it's a quite thin shell. And because you're assuming that there's no really efficient loss of energy from this bubble, other than the work that it does on its surroundings, then the sort of important parameters here are sort of the mechanical luminosity, time, and the background density. And you can basically do some dimensional analysis, just like you do for a Sedov-Taylor solution of a supernova blast wave. And this is sort of the evolution that you get for the pressure of the bubble, which drives all of the dynamics, and the radius of the bubble. Okay. One other end of that is basically assuming that replacing this contact discontinuity with sort of a turbulent radiative mixing layer, where mixing between the hot gas and the surrounding cold gas is efficient enough that you get enough cooling lost that you move from that sort of nice energy-driven regime to a momentum-driven regime, and basically that makes these wind bubbles much less efficient at sort of doing work on their surroundings and blowing apart the clouds in which they live. And so here I'm just going to quickly show you a simulation of 3D Athena simulation of that. This is showing density, gas pressure, cooling rate density, and then the wind mass fraction. And you can see sort of that picture that I was just outlining. There's really, really significant cooling at this turbulent mixing layer between the interior low density, high pressure gas and the surrounding cold gas. And it turns out that, if I can click this, that if you look at the total radial momentum carried by those bubbles over time, then these black lines I'm showing you are basically that momentum-driven solution. So the total momentum is just the input momentum times time. Assume this is 1 for a second. And the simulations I'm showing you here are these lines, and the black lines are sort of that with alpha p equals 1. So you're nearly following this momentum-driven solution because of this, the idea is because of this efficient mixing process. And so the different lines here I'm just showing you are sort of different masses of the cluster that's driving this wind. So this is a very high mass cluster and a very low mass cluster. If you do a bunch of math that I don't have time to go into or explain, that you can basically derive that this momentum enhancement factor that I just talked about up here can be derived based on boundary conditions on the bubble surface. That's basically how this diffusion velocity, how quickly are you able to move stuff out of the hot gas into the surrounding cold gas, and what is the geometry of the surface of the bubble. And in particular, what I'm saying here is that it's not momentum driven, right? This alpha p depends on the scaling of these things. And you can show that in a simulation by running 2 simulations with different input momenta that have nearly about the same output momentum. So that's telling you that this sort of dynamics is directly determined by these sorts of mixing processes. In particular, if you change how these things, this dissipation that I was talking about and geometry scales in time in the simulation. So for example, if I add in magnetic fields, it shuts off a lot of the instabilities at this interface, and it changes the fractal dimension scaling of the bubble in time. So basically, how does that surface area scale with respect to its linear dimension? And if you run simulations at higher and higher resolution, you see the MHD simulations, you get more and more momentum as you go to higher resolution. And in hydro, you get less and less momentum as you go to higher resolution. And what that's fundamentally pointing out is that you are not resolving the correct dissipative scales that are determining the actual processes of how momentum is put into these simulations. And you rederive those sorts of results by sort of a bunch of stuff that I don't have time to go into. But the sort of momentum-like scaling of the hydrodynamic simulations and the sort of opposite resolution dependence of the hydro and MHD simulations. So that's all numerics. What if you put in we actually understand how this turbulent diffusion should work in reality to some extent. If you put that in sort of our understanding of how this realistic diffusivity and realistic geometry should work, how does that change the momentum solution that you should get? You actually get something like a momentum-driven solution, nearly alpha p order unity in reality. So you can't simulate this because the resolution requirements for doing that are absurd, but you can write down a prediction for what it would look like. Okay, so main takeaways, dissipative scales are important. I didn't get a chance to talk about the details of them. But this sort of picture that I'm laying out sort of says the difference between the geometry and the dissipation is sort of what's determining the momentum evolution of these bubbles. And as sort of a corollary that I don't have time to get into, this likely, if you're aware of it, I'll just say that mixing layer simulations have this weird property. When you don't resolve the dissipative scales, they still have the same amounts of cooling happening in them as a function of resolution. You go to higher resolution, you get the same answer. And that's sort of a conspiracy between this geometry and dissipation in those simulations, I would say. But because when you put in the sort of realistic idea of how this turbulence and geometry should work, you still get something like this efficiently cooled momentum-driven solution, which explains the observations of star-forming regions that why wind bubbles are not very efficient at destroying their surrounding molecular clouds. How much time do I have?
1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes, okay. Quickly, I'll say, so that was all about winds. I have the simulations that I'm going to show you here are winds, photoionizing radiation, and non-equilibrium hydrogen photochemistry. So this has sort of FUV heating. It's a quite realistic H2 region, I would say. So we can see this in motion. I'm showing you here temperature, gas pressure, density, cooling rate density, electron fraction, so that's coming from sort of non-equilibrium photochemistry of this, and then sort of a phase breakdown of all of these things. We have the photoionized gas, this hot wind bubble, free wind, this warm hot ionized mixing layer, that's where all the cooling of the wind bubble is going on. But you can see that sort of our very simple 1D pictures of how H2 regions evolve is, I mean, no one ever thought they were real, but they're really not real if you look at a really detailed simulation. So sort of what I'm thinking about working on next is what we can use these simulations to do to, what we can use these simulations for to sort of predict observational signatures and learn about the dynamics of these wind bubbles. And so this week I was here talking with Yifei a little bit, and I sent him one of my sort of lower resolution simulations, and he made some, using his M3 code, made some mock emission lines. So I'm showing you H beta, N2, S2, and O3, and this will be really nice for upcoming spectral surveys of star-forming regions in the Milky Way, like the local volume mapper. So I'm looking forward to working on that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
This might be a very naive question, but at one point, I may have misheard you, but it sounded like the necessity of momentum in the process was more just a scale issue. Was momentum is fundamentally vectorial, you can't get rid of it. You have to give it to something else.
Trying to think how to, like you're right, it's the momentum. I'm thinking of momentum here as sort of the total radial momentum, which to some degree takes out the vector quantity. You're looking at the divergence sort of the momentum field. But you're always going to have like linear conservation of linear momentum in all of these situations. It's just about to what degree you can do excess work on your surroundings, right? You'll do just as much work in one direction statistically as you will in the other. The linear momentum will be conserved, but you can get out more sort of outward radial momentum depending on how efficiently you trap energy.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Mixing layers tend to give you a lot of emission from temperatures like a few 100,000 degrees. Is there any evidence for that?
So you mean in stellar wind bubbles?
Well, whenever
Yeah.
you mix hot and cool gas and the energy is coming out, it
Yeah.
tends to be.
Yeah. So in stellar wind bubbles, definitely. The emission is pretty hard to see because you have an H2 region right there that's just much brighter. You're not getting those same sorts of lines, but optically you would. The thing that I'm definitely aware of within wind bubbles at least is absorption features in O6 and stuff like that. You definitely see. Yeah. That was seen even in the 70s, I think.
The mixing would tend to give you emission in particular, so it's the UV emission line.
Yeah, I've been meaning to look into in more detail what exactly, so in particular, most of the cooling in this mixing layer is done by Lyman alpha. Yeah, I mean, there's mixed gas. I can show it. The problem is that most of the Lyman alpha in that region is coming from the photoionized gas, which has much more energy. So it's really hard to pick that out. But there are other lines that you probably should see. Yeah.
The question over here, go ahead.
So the things that you didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about, the turbulent dissipation and the fractal nature of the surface.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious where those scalings came from. Because you did flash up a figure from a fielding paper. I'm just wondering if that's what you were using there.
Yeah, no, you could. So you mean specifically the fractal dimension?
And also the turbulent dissipation, but
Yeah.
whichever you have time to explain.
Yeah, fractal dimension you can just measure directly. I do measure them directly in my simulations, so they are exactly what is in Drummond's papers as well. It's a D equals 1/2 fractal. It's different, actually deleted. I heard the bell and deleted a few slides before I came up here, but I had one that showed, maybe I should have put it at the end, that showed the difference in fractal dimensions scaling between the MHD and the hydro. That leads to basically this difference. The MHD is more like, well, it's different because it shuts down things on small scales first before it shuts down things on large scales, so you have sort of a different scale dependence of the fractal nature, but it's maybe overall more like a quarter than half. The dissipation, the turbulent dissipation, the theory part basically comes from sort of a more simplified, more widely applicable version of Drummond's mixing theory. The numerical dissipation, which I spend a lot of time looking into here, doesn't come from any sort of real physics. It basically has to do with energy dynamics in the mixing layer and the fact that the velocity at which gas moves into that surface acts as a boundary condition on the bubble, which determines the pressure interior to the bubble, which for an isobaric cooling layer also determines the cooling rate. So the balance of those things basically determines what that inflow velocity is in the numerical case. Yeah.
Do you have any further questions? Oh yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that there's like this scale that cannot be resolved realistically to converge on the diffusion laws. So what's the scale and why it's not just like the turnover at the boundary layer?
Yeah, so it would be, it's the scale, it is that. It is the, so there are basically two relevant ways of mixing. There's actual physical conduction, in which the relevant length to resolve is the field length. or something like the field length, on the order of the field length, which is basically balancing conduction against cooling. And then there's this thing which basically is similar to what's in Dunn and Fielding's paper. It's the scale on which the eddy turnover time is equal to the cooling time. And for the pressures associated with these wind bubbles, that scale is very small. So I'm showing you here, as a function of the bubble radius for a given pressure, how this is sort of the range of pressures that I want to probe in my simulations. This is black line is the resolution, and these are the sort of dissipative scales. So you're off by up to 2 orders of magnitude, unfortunately.
So let's thank our speaker again. So our fourth speaker today is CFA person Philippe Reekie on microbial entombment and preservation of life within extraterrestrial cells. Can't wait.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Philippe. So if anyone who hasn't met me, I work here at the CFA, and I work as an outreach specialist. But before I worked here, I was a researcher of astrobiology at the University of Edinburgh, and I did a really exciting project for about 6 years. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to share an interesting, compelling narrative about the type of work that I dabbled in. Oh, this is not working. Excuse me one moment. No, it is still not working. I'm just going to use the keypad. Okay, so starts off with this. So amber. Amber is a truly remarkable material because in paleobiology, amber has the ability to encase, to entomb biology and preserve it in exquisite detail. And so, let's see if one of these lasers works. Yes, it does. So this spider right here looks like it might have died just yesterday. You can see the hairs on its legs, and we can even work out its last meal. But this spider is about 120 million years old. And so when I was working in astrobiology, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was a material like amber that we could find in extraterrestrial environments? So I went on a bit of a mission, and I did discover something, which is salt. When I talk about salt, I'm talking about a whole family of different minerals. So sulfides, sulfates, chlorides, including common table salt, which is sodium chloride. So salt is fascinating because when salt grows and precipitates out of a salty environment, if there is microbiology present in this environment, then on occasion, these microbes can get trapped inside of the salt. And they get trapped inside of these little fluid inclusions over here. And when this happens, the microbes can be preserved for hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years. And this is something that's been reported in the literature countless times. On most occasions, the microbes are not survivable, they're not living, they're deceased matter, but we can still tell that it was something living in the past. And I'm going to share with you the most extreme cases. In the year 2000, a paper was published where the authors found this block of salt from the Alps, and inside of this block of salt, there were these microbes inside of it, and they claimed that these microbes are 250 million years old. But that's not the crazy part. The craziest part is that these microbes were still alive, and they were reproducing in their lab. Now, I should say that this paper is highly controversial in the field of astrobiology, so take it with a pinch of salt. I'm so sorry, I had to say that at some point during this talk. But regardless of whether or not this is true, it's still been reported numerous of times, this whole phenomenon called microbial entombment, which is the entombment of cells and the preservation of them. So why am I rambling on about salt? Well, it turns out that the solar system is a very, very salty place. Here on the surface of Mars, the NASA Curiosity took this picture. these are sedimentary rocks with crisscrossing veins of sulfates. And in fact, I have the exact sulfate we've discovered on Mars. This is calcium sulfate. See, it's just a show and tell as well right here. So I have some calcium sulfate. So my argument for a very long time is that if we want to find evidence of extraterrestrial life, perhaps a really good place to look is in the extraterrestrial salt. So that has been my argument for a very long time. And so when I was at the University of Edinburgh, I was in a lab and I was essentially just growing different types of salts over and over again with embedded biology. And so what I wanted to find out was what salt is the best salt for entombing and preserving life. It turns out that sodium chloride, your typical table salt, is phenomenal at doing this. And the reason for that is because sodium chloride can generate huge amounts of fluid inclusions, and these fluid inclusions are vital for entombing these microbes. So this sample right here is filled with biology, but you can't see it. So what I did was that I stained all of the cells with this special dye, and when I switch on the UV lights, now you can suddenly see all of the biology. And so every single one of these fluid inclusions are illuminating in UV light, and because they were stained with this glow. And so this sample is actually still in my lab in the University of Edinburgh. And so theoretically, if no one touches this sample, these microbes could be preserved for the next 500 million years. I don't think it will last that long, but we'll see. But anyone who knows Martian geochemistry well will know that the most common type of salt on the surface of Mars is not sodium chloride. It is in fact something called a perchlorate. So the concentrations of perchlorates on Mars are 10,000 times greater than the concentrations of perchlorates on Earth. This is a huge problem because perchlorates are horrible. Biology does not like perchlorates. They are incredibly corrosive. They are powerful oxidizing agents, and every single time I did any experiments with perchlorates in biology, my cells would just blow up. And so they weren't very, very happy. So this is a huge problem. However, one day I was at the pub with my friend, and we were having a chat about science. Some of the best talks about science happen at a pub. And my friend is a cardiologist, and he told me, he said, instead of looking at salt crystals, have you considered salt glasses? And I thought he was probably like one too many deep in beers, and I was like, this is very, very interesting though. Because in biomedical research, they actually use glasses, really, really cold glasses, to preserve cells, and they do this in cancer research. So I was thinking, okay, why don't I transition from salt crystals to salt glasses? And my supervisor thought I had lost the plot a little bit. But there is a very interesting thing about glasses. So they're unlike crystals. So when crystals grow, the rearrangement of atoms during crystal growth can often puncture and rupture biology. And the easiest way to demonstrate this is this highly sophisticated experiment I did at home, where you take your fruit out of the freezer and just let it thaw naturally. And you'll notice that all its juices just kind of pool out. And the reason why this happens is because the ice crystals that formed inside of these berries, they ruptured the fragile biology within they ruptured the fragile cells inside of this berry. But if you compare it to like a glass resin, so this is a plant in a museum that's been encased in a glass resin and will therefore be preserved for a very, very long time. So glasses could actually be more compelling than looking at salt crystals. And then I came across some research I did in the past on tardigrades. I used to work on tardigrades. And so tardigrades, I'm sure many people know this guy. So tardigrades are very resilient to all kinds of different extremes. And so one of the ways that they can survive extreme environments is when they sense danger, they expel their juices. And what happens is that they vitrify their organs. They literally turn their organs into glass, which is really, really weird. So that's one of the ways that they can survive extremes. And so going back to perchlorates, which is the most abundant salt species on Mars, I was in a lab and I was like, okay, why don't I try to turn this perchlorate salt into a glass? Turns out it's actually really, really simple. You take a solution of water, you mix perchlorate in, and you create a super saturated solution of perchlorate. And all you do is you chill it down, you cool it down, and the cooling rate, it doesn't matter. You can cool it down slowly. So I would cool it down, and around minus 120 degrees Celsius, perchlorates vitrify. They turn into a glass, which is one of the most weirdest phenomenon in nature, because generally speaking, when you form a glass, like let's say a volcanic glass, you get a very hot lava and you have to immediately quench it to stop the crystal growth from occurring. Whereas in perchlorates, they're just like, nah, we're fine with forming a glass regardless of the cooling rate. So in my lab, here we have my perchlorates. This is a magnesium perchlorate filled with biological cells, and they're filled with a cell called Bacillus subtilis. And everyone in this room is filled with Bacillus subtilis because it is a microbe that lives in your gut that is currently digesting that sandwich you ate half an hour ago. And so this is filled with biology, and on the right, I keep forgetting this is not working. On the right-hand side, this is the exact same sample. Exact same sample, but vitrified. And so in both cases, they're filled with biology. And so when I crack open my glass, lo and behold, there are all these microbes, microbial colonies just embedded inside of this perchlorate glass. Now, Bacillus subtilis is a rod-shaped cell, and as you can see, none of these are rod-shaped. They're all spherical because they were probably very unhappy, and so they sporulated. They turned into spores. And on here on the right-hand side, you can see one of the spores has actually erupted. And this is a common for perchlorates because of osmotic shock. The very high salinity actually punctures the membrane. And so this is a truly bizarre image. With microbiology, so I took these glasses and then I thawed them and I extracted all the microbes out and I observed them in TEM this time. Cells, so this cell here on the left, if you look closely, there is something called a mid-cell division. So right in the middle, it is about to reproduce. So this is a happy cell. It's happy. It feels a sense of nutrients and is about to reproduce. But its buddy on the right-hand side has literally exploded just next to it. And so in this one image, you have both happy cells and unhappy cells, which is extremely characteristic of perchlorates because perchlorates are really, really complicated and very, very strange. And so what I then did is after thawing all of my glasses, I wanted to test to see if these microbes are still alive. Can I then wash these cells from perchlorate and plate them on agar plates to test their growth rates? It turns out that the process of taking cells and vitrifying them in a perchlorate glass at minus 120 degrees Celsius is not lethal to Bacillus subtilis. And so my argument was that perhaps maybe one day we could actually find perchlorate glasses on Mars. We've never discovered perchlorate glasses. We've discovered perchlorates, never in the form of glass. But it's theoretically possible, especially near the poles where the temperature is extremely cold. And I'll leave you with this final page, which is my favorite thing to talk about, is in the year 2019, my colleagues and I published this paper called A Laboratory for Multi-Century Science. And in this paper, I made a proposal for the world's first 1 million year long experiment. I promise you I'm not making this up. So my experiment were all of my salts embedded with microbes, both in crystalline form and in a glass form, to be an exhibition, but also a controlled laboratory where our future ancestors for the next 1 million years will observe my salts and to truly understand how microbes can be preserved for geological time periods. And then the National Museum of Scotland called us up and was like, yes, we want this exhibition in our museum. So next time you're in Scotland, go check out my salts in the National Museum of Scotland. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
Thank you. There have been meteorites over the years which have been claimed to contain biologically significant molecules. Never an actual bacillus. Is there any chance that these guys might survive kind of Martian meteorite series of steps?
It's funny that you mention that because as I wanted to make this more of a show and tell as well, I have with me a real piece of Mars. This is on loan from the Harvard Geological Museum, so anyone who wants to hold it, you're more than welcome to at the end. So this exact specimen does contain some of the salts that I was talking about. And yes, there is a very famous Martian meteorite called ALH 84001, which had these, which would look like microfossils. And this is a rock that came from Mars, and everyone got really, really excited. Turns out that was probably not biology. It was too small to be biology. But yeah, this whole process of transferring biological material from planet to planet is called panspermia, and it's something that NASA have tested over and over again, and they've shown that it is actually feasible. This whole idea of panspermia is actually feasible, but we have no evidence to suggest that it's ever happened in our solar system.
Okay. Any questions? Yes. Oh, how are you? He just gave you his position.
If I missed detail, so is this mechanism dependent on the fluid entrapment in the salt? And if so, how does that fluid entrapment fare over, say, 100 million years of solar exposure and in ultra-high vacuum environments, such as interstellar?
Yes, so for the crystals, so like for these guys, then yes, it solely relies on the fluid inclusions, because if you get biology embedded in this, which isn't inside a fluid inclusion, then it dies. The crystal growth just basically punctures and ruptures all of the biology. So yes, for crystals, fluid inclusions are incredibly important. For my glasses, not important at all, because basically the glass acts like a resin, kind of like the amber that I showed in the first page. It just encases it and protects it. In terms of the UV radiation and the space environment, we've detected fluid inclusions inside asteroidal salts. We actually have bits of asteroid that inside of them contains different types of salt minerals, and within these salt minerals there was tiny little pockets of fluid. So we actually have, I don't know where they are, in certain museums or laboratories around the world, we actually have real extraterrestrial liquids here on Earth, which come from asteroids, and they're from fluid inclusions.
I just wondered if Perseverance has collected any samples you think would be promising, and if not, how do you make them do it?
Yeah, this is something I've been arguing for a very long time. So we are in the process of creating these cores for a sample return mission on Mars, which is very, very exciting. I actually don't know exactly what cores we've selected so far, but I'm hoping we bring back something salty, definitely.
Any further questions? Let's thank all of our speakers.
If anyone wants to hold Mars, it's over here.
Yeah, survived
Yeah, it's Mars. It's tiny. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's actually part of the rock. I was also thinking the same thing.